Okay, good morning, and uh, everybody, and whether you join us or whether you view this as a recording. We're going to continue our discussion about the immune system. And of course, this is something which is just terribly important to us at the moment. And quite inadvertently, we hear a tremendous amount about the immune system and immune function because of all the discussion about the ongoing pandemic, where it's become critical for our understanding of what is happening. So I hope that by the time we finished these few classes on the immune system, that you will have a good understanding, and you'll always also be able to answer some of people's questions, particularly about issues, for instance, like vaccination and that sort of thing. So this is where we finished off the last time, and we were discussing the functions of the immune system. We stated that there were three particular features that the immune system recognizes. That is, first of all, it recognizes pathogens. It recognizes the incursion of pathogens of many different kinds. The bacteria, fungi, viruses, parasites, all of these things elicit an immune response. The immune system also responds to damage to tissues, responds to the presence of damaged or dying cells. And very, very importantly, it responds to changes in cells which might lead them to become tumorous or cancerous. When we look at those three things, pathogen, the fact that it responds to pathogens, damaged cells, and tumor cells, we realize we can summarize the function of the immune system. The immune system is examining the organism and is deciding what is truly self, what is truly belongs to the organism, and what does not, what is not self. Think of it this way. Pathogens, obviously, they're not self. Damaged cells, they are no longer functional. They are no longer properly functional, and they begin to look different to the rest of the cells. They are recognized as being not self. The same with tumor cells. Tumor cells alter, they very frequently alter their protein structures, for example, and the immune system recognizes that as being not self and responds, attempts to get rid of it. There's the central function of the immune system, encapsulated for you. It distinguishes self from non-self under ideal circumstances. Sometimes it goes a little bit wrong, as I mentioned towards the end, but by and large, that is its principal function. We saw, I showed you also, just briefly discussed that there are two major arms to the immune responses. The first are innate immune responses, the innate immune system, innate immunity. And this is all living things have some degree of innate immunity. All of them are able to respond to pathogen, for example, by trying to get rid of it, even bacteria. But jawed vertebrates have another layer of immunity, another layer to the immune system called the adaptive immune system. The innate immune system is unable to learn. It is unable to change. It just responds in a set pattern to certain situations. The adaptive immune system is quite different. The adaptive immune system learns to respond to things it has never seen before. And it forms a memory of those things so that if it sees them again, it can respond more rapidly and more powerfully the next time. There's the principle of vaccination, for example, as we'll see later on. So there's the innate immune system is itself very, very powerful. And by and large, it offers a tremendous amount of protection to an organism. Now, I want to try and explain something to you about the way in which we, for example, are structured. We are essentially a hollow tube. We have an outside. But then if you think about our entire gut, The gut runs through us as a tube, but the tube is in communication with the outside at two places, right? So the tube, the inside, the gut cavity, is actually also outside in a way. And you can think of it, we've got skin, which is the outside, and we've got the gut, the lining, the gut cavity, which is inside, outside. But the surrounding the gut and in the thorax, remember, we have a whole gut cavity, a coelom. And that coelom is the true inside. It's the real inside. The outside is by no means sterile, and neither is the gut cavity. The gut cavity is not sterile at all. It has a huge bacterial population. But that inside cavity, the coelom, is for all intents and purposes sterile, and it has to be kept sterile. Our organs, a huge responsibility of the immune system is to ensure that that gut cavity and our organs remain pathogen free, and really that they are always self, or the cells are always kept as self. Any non-self that appears in the gut cavity or in the organs needs to be very quickly dealt with. So the first thing to realize is that we need to protect the inside of our body, which is essentially sterile. We need to protect it from incursion from the outside. And outside is the outside, or what is in the gut cavity. We have to try and stop things from moving across from outside to that sterile, sacrosanct inside. Immunologists will tell you that the most powerful immune organ of all is the epithelium, because the epithelium on our outside, for example, our skin, is specially designed to protect the inside. Our skin cells, for example, are very tightly tied together to one another to prevent, so there's no channels for things to move through the skin into the inside. Second of all, our skin is specially designed so that it continually produces cells which flake off, and they carry away with them potential pathogens. The third thing about our skin is that it has its own resident population of bacteria, which it nurtures. And that resident population of non-pathogenic bacteria prevents pathogenic bacteria from being able to establish a hold on our skin and maybe penetrate. The last thing about the skin is that we actually produce especially antibacterial substances. We're in our sweat and in the oils that we produce from our skin, which act as disinfectants of the skin. So the outside skin is very, very powerfully protective of the inside. On the inside, for example, our respiratory tract, which could also be regarded as being a place where things could move from the outside to the inside. Our gut cavity, where it is extremely likely, a very dangerous situation, because we have many, many, many bacteria in our gut and are just a thin gut lining. That lining, the epithelium, the mucous membranes that line our respiratory tract and our gut, have to be very carefully designed to stop anything from moving across those walls into the sacred inside sterile part of the body. The major way that those surfaces are protected is by the production of mucus. And mucus is a very complex substance. It traps pathogens. It acts as a barrier that they cannot move across. but it also contains many different substances, including antibody and things like that, which act against pathogens and stop them from being able to move across the gut wall or across the respiratory tract walls into the organs and tissues of the body. So all of these things we refer to as barrier defenses, and they are very powerful. When they are breached, for instance, by a wound or something like that, by and large, the immune system reacts very, very quickly and very, very strongly to that breach in order to try and protect us even further, and we'll see how that is done. So we regard the barrier defenses as being a major part of the innate immune system. The rest of the innate immune system, excuse me, depends on the activity of certain elements of the cellular components of the blood. It depends on certain aspects of living systems, which comprise the innate section of our immune system. And all of our the rest of the immune responses that we're going to talk about depend upon the activity of white blood cells. These are the other name for white blood cells, are the leukocytes. We have referred to them before when we talked about blood, about in circulation and everything, but I'll go over these again because we need to understand their roles quite carefully. So the first thing to realize is some white blood cells are involved with the innate immune responses. Some white blood cells are involved with the adaptive immune responses. And then there is communication between the two. There's communication between innate and the adaptive system. So we'll have a look first at the cells which are involved with largely with the innate. The most important one to look at here, these are what blood cells look like when they're in circulation in the blood system. You'll see why I specify that in a second. This here is a monocyte. And I told you before, monocytes, the one way you can recognize them, the nucleus is large and it's like the peach emoji. It's got a crease in there like that. The monocytes, when you see them circulating in the blood, you can't tell what their fate is going to be because there's largely two fates to them. The one is that they form a cell called a macrophage. The macrophages are able to leave the blood circulatory system. Our body is full of macrophages. Our tissues are full of macrophages. They wander around the tissues the whole time. They are like amoebae. They move like amoebae. And they are able to respond to the presence of damage, first of all, and second of all, they are able to respond to the presence of pathogens. They recognize pathogens in the body, and they actually alert the rest of the immune system to the fact that pathogens are present. So the macrophages are like sentinels. They are on guard throughout the body in all of our organs. So when macrophage, we'll do this in more detail, but I'll just tell you briefly the story because it explains the function of some of the other white blood cells. When a macrophage in the tissue, for example, sees bacteria are present, it will actually ingest some of the bacteria, digest them, and it goes through all sorts of cellular processing. And it will send out messages to the rest of the immune system. It sends out messages in the form of hormones, of immune hormones. And those alert other white blood cells that an infection has taken place. The major response is by these white blood cells here, which are called the neutrophils. And neutrophils are easy to recognize because they always have these very complicated nuclei with lots of lobes on them. And you'll see them called polymorphonuclear leukocytes. I'm not going to force you to learn the name. Polymorphonuclear leukocytes simply means white blood cells with nuclei that take many shapes. And you can always recognize them. They have these peculiar nuclei. They are relatively small white blood cells, and they are the most numerous of all of the white blood cells. If you look at a blood slide, we'll see in a minute. If you look at a blood slide, usually the neutrophils are the most common of all of the white blood cells. They are the soldiers of the immune system, and they are entirely involved with the innate response. When a macrophage sends out a message that a pathogen is present, for example, or the damage has occurred, neutrophils will flood into that area, and they start to actively chase down and eat up debris, pathogens, anything that is present. They're relatively short-lived, and they tend to accumulate. They can accumulate at the site of an infection, for example, but they don't leave it very easily. So they accumulate and die, and that is what forms the pus. Pus is largely formed out of used up neutrophils. So I should also tell you that there is another cell present, which we're going to refer to much later on, but I'll point it out right here. It is a leukocyte. They're not very, you don't see them in circulation, but they are present in quite large numbers throughout our tissues. And these are the mast cells. And mast cells, you can see here, are full of granules. And mast cells respond very strongly to insult. That is, they respond very strongly to damage, for example, to sudden incursion of a pathogen or something like that. And they respond by releasing these granules. And the granules are largely composed of substances like histamine, which causes the dilation of blood vessels. And that is one of the first signs, for example, that damage has occurred, or that the body thinks that damage has occurred. Just slap your arm like this and see how it turns red. You know why it turns red? It turns red because some of the mast cells in that area are releasing histamine, and they cause the blood vessels to dilate temporarily. This is actually to make entrance especially of the neutrophils, much easier. So there's sort of a cooperation. Often the mast cells are the very first to respond to damage to a tissue. The macrophages in the area will also respond to damage, and they will send out messages to the rest of the immune system, and the neutrophils will begin to flood in. These cells here, the eosinophils and basophils, in some ways behave something like the mast cells, but we won't talk about them in any great detail. They are relatively uncommon in circulation, and they tend to accumulate in areas, especially where inflammation is constant, where there's constant excitement of the immune system. They become very important in processes, for instance, like asthma and in allergic reactions. We're not going to talk very much about eosinophils or basophils. Watch these three, in particular, monocytes, neutrophils, mast cells, when we talk about the innate responses to real damage, as I'll show you in a second. The lymphocytes here, there are two kinds of lymphocyte. All of the lymphocytes, when they're in circulation, they're a small cell, and the nucleus almost fills the cell. It's a round nucleus. In circulation, we can't tell which lymphocyte we're looking at because there are different kinds of lymphocytes. The two that we are going to be particularly concerned with are the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes. They get those names, B and T, because all of our blood cells are produced in the bone marrow, but the B lymphocytes mature in the bone marrow. That's why they labeled B. The T lymphocytes mature in the thymus and in some other tissues, but the thymus is a gland here underneath your breastbone. So they are labeled T lymphocytes because they mature in the thymus. The B and T lymphocytes, as we're going to learn, these are involved with the adaptive response. So for the moment, we're not going to talk much about them. Just have it in your mind that the B and T lymphocytes, they are largely responsible for adaptive responses, especially for production of substances like antibody. Okay, so here they are. This is what they look like on a blood smear. Here you are. Look at the lymphocyte. You can immediately recognize it. The smaller cell with a large nucleus that almost fills the cell. Here's a monocyte. I showed you this before. You can recognize it because its nucleus has this crease in it like that. These here are the neutrophils there. And you can see that they're neutrophils because the nucleus is got lots of lobes to it. These in the background, of course, are red blood cells. And remember the little platelets that we talked about before. This is an eosinophil. This is a basophil. We're not going to worry about them for the moment. Just notice something, and that is that like the mast cells, which you won't ever see in circulation, like the mast cells, though, these are full of granules, and those granules, when they're released, cause all sorts of reactions in the tissues around them. Okay, so dealing now just with the innate part, the innate immune system. The innate immune system is designed to respond to damage and to incursion of pathogen. But it only responds to classes of pathogen. The innate cells involved with the innate immune system, for example, have a set of responses. They respond to all gram-positive bacteria the same way. It doesn't matter if the bacteria are different from one another. They respond to all of the gram-positive bacteria in the same way. They respond to fungi in the same way. So the response is quite broad, and it cannot be refined. The cells can't learn about new pathogens and to respond in a different way. They always just respond the same way to them. And that's the first thing about the innate responses. The cells of the innate response respond to particular molecules on the surface of pathogens. So that we call that pathogen-associated molecular patterns, PAMP. The cells of the innate response respond to PAMP, to pathogen-associated molecular patterns. There are particular molecules on the surface of pathogens which will excite the white blood cells that are in the innate response. There is another aspect, though, to the innate response, and it's a very important one. But unfortunately, we're not going to have time to discuss it. Because it's actually really, really complicated. But the body produces some sets of proteins which are also involved in especially dealing with early stages of infections by things like bacteria and viruses. The first set of proteins is called complement, and it's largely produced by the liver. Complement is actually, it makes it sound like it's one thing, but it's actually many different proteins that interact with one another. Complement is extremely powerful, but it's also extremely dangerous because complement is very undiscriminating, and it can actually cause damage to our own cells, to the organism itself, if it was to circulate just in active form. So instead, complement has this very complicated interaction of several different proteins that is only set off when a pathogen is present. So its action is very directed towards pathogens and not directed towards the rest of the body. So that, just remember, we're not going to talk about complement in great detail. We'll mention it once or twice, but just remember that name, complement, with the E, and complement is a set of proteins produced by the liver, which are involved in dealing largely with pathogens like bacteria. It actually can do things, for example, like punch holes in the cell membrane of bacteria. The other set of proteins you may have heard of, they're called the interferons, and they are produced by cells which have been infected with virus. And the interferons, their main function, they're produced by cells which are already infected, but they protect other cells. They induce other cells to erect defenses against viral infection. So those are both part of the innate response, complement and the interferons. And the next thing that we need to talk about is this, we'll talk about this in a little bit of detail, is the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is the set of procedures that the innate cells of the immune system go through in order to deal with situations, for instance, like infection by bacteria. And I'll show you in a diagram form how that works. So that's the innate system. The problem is, well, there's a huge advantage to the innate system. First of all, it works very, very quickly. It begins within seconds. Mast cells release their histamine, for example, within seconds of damage occurring. So it begins very quickly. But it's very undirected. It's like a shotgun approach to trying to deal with pathogens. If all the jawed vertebrates possess another layer to the immune system, and that is the adaptive immune system or adaptive immunity. And the adaptive immune system is able to recognize very, very small characteristics of particular pathogens, a particular virus, a particular bacterium is dealt with quite differently to the way that another is. And the adaptive immune system is called adaptive because it can learn. You can present it with an entirely new pathogen, and within a certain amount of time, it will learn to deal with that pathogen specifically, and that pathogen only, and it will keep a memory of that action. So if it ever sees it again, it can deal with it very easily. This is largely, as we'll learn later, governed by the lymphocytes. And the lymphocytes actually produce, within the adaptive immune response, there are two layers to it. The first is called the humoral response, and that is something that you've already heard about. You already probably know. The humoral response is production of antibody. And we'll discuss exactly what that means, exactly what that is a bit later. The antibodies defend against infection by attacking directly particular pathogens. The second part of the adaptive response is one that you may not know about. And that is that there are a set of T lymphocytes whose purpose it is to find cells which have been infected or which have been transformed into tumor cells, for example. In other words, those T cells recognize non-self cells and kill them. They kill them directly. And this is called the cell-mediated response. And we'll see that there's a close interaction between these two. When we respond to something like COVID, for example, we are responding in two ways. The one is that we produce antibody to the virus, but the other is that we have an arm of the adaptive immune system which is going to seek out cells which are infected by virus and try to kill them. In addition, by the way, there's a very strong innate response to COVID, which is part of its problem, as I'll discuss in a little while. Okay, so basically this just tells you about interferon and about the complement system, and really I don't for the moment need you to know any more than that. If you want to read more about complement, I think that there is a paragraph or two in your textbook. So let's have a look and see some of the functions of the cells initially involved with the innate system. Now, the innate system has that advantage. It's very, very quick. The adaptive immune system has a disadvantage that it actually takes time. It takes about 5 to 10 days for us to produce a full-blown adaptive immune response. And so we need to understand how it is that the cells of the innate system manage to act so quickly. Well, first of all, a major function of several of the cells of the immune system is that they are able to actually ingest pathogen. So they will take pathogen in and they treat it as food. They ingest it as if it was a food item. And it's just like we saw before in the first semester of biology. They take in the pathogen in a vacuole like this, and the vacuole is united with some sort of lysosome, that is a vesicle containing digestive enzymes. And the digestive enzymes kill and digest the pathogen, and the cell, whatever it is, a macrophage, and neutrophils to a certain extent, will gain some nutrient from the pathogen. So that's fine, that's easy to understand. But in actual fact, there's a lot more going on in several of these cells, and especially in cells like the macrophage. Because when the macrophage, first of all, it recognizes PAMP, pathogen-associated molecular patterns, on the surface of this bacterium, for example. That is what induces it to ingest it. And when it ingests it, it actually puts it through a series of really complex processes. It doesn't just simply digest it and eat it. It actually, the macrophage, for example, will cut up the pathogen into small pieces, and it will take those pieces and it will exhibit them on the surface, on the cell surface. There. That is so that it can interact with other cells. Other cells will come along and actually interact with that displayed portion of the pathogen. Anything which excites activity in the immune system, like we call an antigen. An antigen is something that excites the activity of the immune system. So what the things like the macrophage are doing is they are exhibiting antigen on the surface. There are only a few cells which will do this. But just to give you the names now, that when we looked at that monocyte circulating in the blood system, I told you it could have different fates when it ended up in the tissues. One is to form macrophages, that we've discussed. The other is to form a cell called a dendritic cell, which is very similar to a macrophage, but which behaves differently once it ingests. Does the same, exhibits on the surface like this, but the dendritic cell immediately migrates, and it migrates from the tissues to a lymph node. So the macrophage tends to stay resident near the site of infection. The dendritic cell moves to a lymph node to communicate with other cells. Both of them exhibit antigen on their surface there. that's not the only thing that happens. Macrophages are tremendously important signaling cells. As soon as they recognize pathogen-associated molecular patterns and begin this ingestion process, they begin releasing hormones, immunological hormones, which go into the blood circulatory system and which excite tremendous amount of activity in the blood circulatory system. They, for instance, call in neutrophils to the site of the infection. So macrophages have a lot of very important roles to play. I don't think that this will work. No, it won't. Sorry. In your slide set, just go and have a look at that little movie. They unfortunately don't work with Zoom for some reason or another. It's a fascinating movie of a neutrophil, and you can see the neutrophil actually chasing a bacterium, actually following a bacterium and then engulfing it. So the neutrophils behave a little bit differently to the macrophages. Neutrophils are voracious predators. They will eat as many pathogens as they can possibly get hold of, all bits of damaged cells, everything. But they are short-lived. They burn out very quickly. Macrophages are long-lived, and they are present in all of our tissues. And you've already heard how they are now acting as sentinels. If they see something wrong, they call in cells like the neutrophils to come and do the real work. So we think of the neutrophils as being the soldiers. The macrophages are like the generals. But the neutrophils are the foot soldiers who do all the fighting. The dendritic cells, very like macrophages, excepting that their responsibility is to go to the lymph nodes. And what they do is they inform the adaptive immune system that something is going on. And they tell the adaptive immune system, in fact, what to do. The dendritic cells are critical in directing the activity of the adaptive immune system cells, the lymphocytes. We'll see that in much more detail. There's one thing, though, that I must tell you that becomes really important when we talk about the adaptive immune system, and that is that those lymphocytes, the B lymphocytes, are also able to phagocytose and present antigen. This is a really important part of the adaptive response, as you'll see. Just bear it in mind that these three, macrophages, dendritic cells, and B lymphocytes, are antigen presenting cells, APC, antigen presenting cells. They are able to digest complex antigen, cut it into small pieces, and display those antigenic portions on their cell membrane. Neutrophils can also phagocytose. They do so very vigorously. They don't display. Okay, so before we proceed, we've got to kind of get the geography of the immune system clear in our minds. We understand now what the cells are, the most important cells, but we've got to get their locations and everything clear in our heads, because this is really important. The immune system, the immune function, is largely tied to the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system, you'll remember, when arterioles in our circulatory system, which are under high pressure from the heart, transform and join through the capillary beds to venous capillaries. Because of that sudden decrease in the diameter of the blood vessels and their proliferation in the capillary bed, a tremendous pressure builds up at the start of the capillaries. And this causes fluid to leak out of the capillaries. As it leaks out, most of the blood cells are actually filtered out. So it mostly leaks out as a clear straw-colored fluid. In other words, the serum of the blood is passing across into the tissues and bathing the tissues. It carries with it nutrients and oxygen and all sorts of things. But in addition, it's going to perform a very important function in the immune system, because that clear fluid is gathered up into the lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels is like a second circulatory system which runs through the body, almost parallel to the blood circulatory system. You see, this is a vastly simplified version there, but you can see that there are lymphatic vessels that run through all of the tissues, and they function in a similar way to the way that the veins function, in that there is very low pressure in the lymphatic vessels, but they have valves all the way along them, and muscle action around them compresses and relaxes, and this causes the lymphatic fluid to move in one direction only, and it moves always towards the heart. So from the head, it moves down, assisted, by the way, by gravity. But all of this lymphatic fluid has to be moved up from the periphery all the way through. It moves through greater and greater and greater lymphatic vessels, and eventually they empty into the blood circulatory system just before the heart, in the subclavian veins. They empty into the subclavian vein. So we have this lymphatic fluid moving through the body constantly. It bathes the tissues and then is gathered up in the lymphatic vessels and moves through. But the lymphatic vessels are interrupted every now and again by these small organs here called the lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes are critical to immune function, because these are the places where, for example, most of our B and T cells come to reside. And this is where all of the communication takes place, which is going to lead to the adaptive immune response. Just think how useful the system is, because what it can do is, first of all, it's bathing the tissues. It's picking up information from the tissues. White blood cells of the immune system can actually move through the lymphatic system. Macrophages do, and dendritic cells do immediately they are stimulated. Immediately a dendritic cell picks up that there's a pathogen present, it will start to move, actively migrate to a lymph node. And what is happening is all of the cells of the immune system are gathering here in the lymph nodes to communicate. In addition, the lymph can actually pick up antigen. It can pick up bits and pieces of foreign material and carry that to the lymph node as well, for it to be perceived by cells of the immune system. So this the lymphatic system is really, really important. And in addition, there are sets of immune tissue throughout our body, which actually form separate organs, separate immune organs. The very first ones that you probably know about already are the tonsils and the adenoids, which are here up in the throat and in the pharynx. And those are there to especially to guard our respiratory tract and the start of our gut tract, to protect as far as possible, protect from ingested or inhaled pathogens. The mucous membranes are very richly endowed with immune tissue. And that is because they are one of the sites where pathogen could potentially move across. And our respiratory tract, for example, is a frequent site of infection. especially by viruses. This we know from the COVID pandemic. Okay, this is a primary source of infection, is through the nose and through the mouth. And there is almost like a separate immune system which is dedicated to trying to stop that kind of infection from proceeding. Then there are some other organs which are specifically have immune function. The spleen, for example, is an organ which actually surveys the blood itself. It is specially designed to survey the blood circulatory system for pathogen. The thymus I've already mentioned underneath the breastbone. That is where the T cells mature. And then there are various other important immune areas as well. Throughout our gut, there are patches which are almost, you can almost think of them as being like flattened lymph nodes. They're called the Peyer's patches. You don't need to remember the name unless you want to. But throughout our gut is almost lined with areas which have immune function. This stands to reason because even our gut bacteria, our commensal gut bacteria, that are completely harmless to us as long as they're in the gut cavity, if they were to move across the gut wall, they could and do. If that happens, if, for example, your gut wall is damaged, broken in some way, and you get gut bacteria moving into the gut cavity, it sets up a rampant infection, which can be extremely, extremely dangerous and very frequently fatal. So the gut is armored with immune protection to guard against any bacteria, even our own harmless commensal bacteria inside the gut, to stop them from being able to move across the gut wall into the body cavities. The take-home message is, throughout our body, this is like a network throughout our body of immune activity, which is protecting us. Okay, so let's just have a look at an actual innate response. This is somewhat simplified, but if you get the principles of this in your mind, you'll be able to understand several things that we'll discuss later, in particular things like allergy and some of the reactions that we're seeing to COVID and things like that. So this is, here we're just going to talk about the innate response itself, and not think about how the adaptive might become involved. Here's a normal situation. You've got the thick skin on the outside. Here is fat and muscle and everything else, the tissues inside, which ought to be sterile. Permeating all of our tissues, of course, are the capillaries and the blood vessels. And all of these red and white blood cells course through here and do not usually make their way across. The only ones which normally make their way across and take up residence in the tissues are mast cells here and the macrophages, which wander around continually on surveillance. So now look at the size, this narrow little vessel here, first of all. Second of all, this vessel, all its cells are tightly stuck to one another, and they prevent these blood cells from moving across. Now we're going to breach this. When we get a splinter through our skin, two things happen when you do that. The first is you cause damage. You insult the tissues. The second thing is it's very likely that you will introduce potential pathogens like bacteria, either on the splinter itself, or you'll push in bacteria which are on the surface of the skin. And now you have potential dangerous situation. You have pathogens now in the sacred, supposedly sterile space. The first thing that happens is the mast cells react very strongly. They react to damage itself, but they also react to the presence of foreign substances, such as that contained on bacteria. And they release many, many different signaling molecules. But the most important one that we'll think about for the moment is histamine. Now, histamine you have heard of, because if you have allergies, what do? You take antihistamines. So the first, histamine has many different effects, but the most noticeable effect is that it immediately causes the muscles in those blood vessels, in the capillaries, to relax. And the capillaries actually expand, and that's the first thing. So the very first symptom that you'll see is redness. So that redness is caused by the dilation of blood vessels in the vicinity of the insult. The second thing that happens is that the walls of the blood vessels become leaky, and they become leaky to two things. The first thing is that they become leaky to fluid, interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid begins to move out into this area. When it does so, what it's doing is it's carrying with it substances like complement, and complement can begin to act on the pathogens. The observable effect of this, when fluid begins to build up, is swelling. The area of injury begins to swell, and the reason it swells is because interstitial fluids begin to build up between the tissues, between the cells and inside the tissues. So that's, we've got, first of all, redness, then we've got swelling. Because of this increased blood flow through these enlarged vessels, this also begins to heat up. And these white blood cells actually work much better at a slightly higher temperature. And the macrophages begin to release hormones. And those hormones will actually increase the metabolic rate, first of all, of localized tissues. So that they also begin to heat up the tissues. What's our third thing we notice? We've got redness, we've got swelling. We put our hands on, we've got heat there. The other thing that the macrophages do, that the hormones the macrophages do, they increase the sensitivity of nerves in the area. They actually, this area becomes much more susceptible to pain. Why? Well, one of the obvious things is, so you don't go poke, 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 poke on the area of injury. You tend to guard this area of injury. And if you move that area of injury, if you poke it, or you just in normal movement, carry on normal movement, etc., you tend to spread these pathogens around. Instead, keep this still, and you stand a better chance of maintaining them as a localized infection. The next thing that happens is the macrophages release hormones, release a set of hormones, which go into circulation, and they actually call neutrophils. They actually cause neutrophils to begin to accumulate near the site of infection and to migrate through the blood vessel walls. You can see them doing it here. And they begin to actively hunt down the pathogens and eat them. And these neutrophils, not only do they move in here, but a signal is sent to the bone marrow to manufacture lots of more neutrophils. So your body begins to manufacture neutrophils, circulate them, and then they tend to, in the area of the infection, they move out of the blood vessels and accumulate here. They don't live long. They die quite quickly, they burn out quite quickly, and they accumulate here as pus. And if the infection is long-lived and vigorous, a lot of pus may accumulate here, and it may actually eventually be expressed as an abscess, for example. And when that happens, if you did get a large collection of pus and it burst to the outside, it carries with it a huge amount of bacterial material as well. It's a way of cleansing, of throwing out a collection of bacteria. Under normal circumstances, however, a small amount of pus accumulates, and then the cells basically end up just eating up the rest of the pathogens, and other cells come in to actually clean up the pus, clean up the damaged cells, and proceed with the healing process. So that is a normal process, a normal innate response. But this is also the typical inflammatory response. And that is a very important word. Inflammation refers to a specific set of immune responses. And they are, as we've just seen, redness, heat, swelling, and pain. Those are the 4 symptoms of inflammation. And here's something to think about. We've only talked about this as being very localized, where a little splinter went into your finger. But what about if this is much more generalized? What if we've got an infection all over our whole body? What if we get innate responses all over our body? All over our body, for example, the blood vessels begin to dilate. The blood vessels begin to become leaky. The metabolism begins to rise. Well, just think about it, and you'll realize that these are also all sorts of symptoms that we associate with illness, with things like, for example, when you get a viral infection in your throat, you get inflammatory responses in your throat. You get swelling, you get pain, you get redness, etc. These hormones released by the macrophages that cause increased metabolism locally can also cause metabolism to rise globally in the whole body, and you end up developing a temperature. So these inflammatory responses are very important. And they can, in fact, when they are global, when they affect the whole body, they can actually begin to be extremely damaging. In COVID-19 infection, many of the fatal responses are actually due to these inflammatory responses, gone wild, uncontrolled. So that is something to think about. Okay, so I'm out of time. So if there are any questions, just shout away. Hello?
No, no questions. Thank you.
All right. Okay, then everyone, and then I'll see you on Friday, all right?